Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Your Mark on the World show. I'm your host, Devin Thorpe, and I'm a Forbes contributor covering social entrepreneurship and impact investing. And our guest today is Siobhan O'Neil, and she's a project lead at the UN think tank at United Nations University. This is going to be an amazing discussion about a really important issue about child soldiers. So stick around. You don't want to miss this episode.
Welcome to Your Mark on the World, bringing you another changemaker with champion of social good, Devin D. Thorpe.
Siobhan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're thrilled to have you and grateful that you would take the time. I know you're extraordinarily busy, but you recently completed a report about what causes or induces kids to get involved in child soldiering. It just seems so tragic, but my impression was that you learned some things that surprised you, that we sometimes misunderstand what's going on. Tell us a little bit about your report.
Absolutely. This report was very much responding to some of the assumptions, often in the public, in the media, in policy spheres, that somehow the new conflicts, the conflicts of today, present sort of fundamentally different challenges than previous conflicts, and that young people who are involved in them for different reasons than the young people who were involved in previous conflicts. So in looking at current contemporary conflicts, Syria and Iraq, Nigeria, Mali, we have empirical evidence now after a 2-year study that suggests there are a lot of similarities. So first of all, children, just like adults, they don't do things for a single reason. So their involvement with armed groups is multi-causal, and it must be a series of structural, social, and individual reasons that combine in some sort of cocktail that influence their involvement. I think the narrative today is often about violent extremism or terrorism, which suggests potentially a really strong ideological component. But when we looked at children in conflict zones, often they have very little ideological motivation, or if they do, sometimes it takes on importance after the fact, after they've been involved with a group or potentially involved in violence. It takes on a post facto justification. But really, these motivations span from the completely mundane to the very sort of complete brink of survival, and it's in a combination. So it's a very difficult individualized journey to understand.
As I think about conflicts in Nigeria and Syria, just to take two cases that you mentioned, they seem to be so fundamentally different. I think about Boko Haram in the jungles of Nigeria and Al-Qaeda or ISIS in Syria. I think those are just completely different situations, and yet you say that they are similar. Talk about that just a little bit, if you would.
Well, actually, I'm very impressed with the way you set up the question, because I think often there is the assumption that groups like Boko Haram and Islamic State are very similar because they have they espouse an ideological component. But the truth is, and what our report really argues, is that viewing groups from this very narrow lens ends up conflating groups that are extremely different and conflicts that have very different drivers. And so, while indeed Boko Haram does have an ideological component, that ideology is very much intertwined with a critique of the Nigerian state. And so that is one of the reasons it resonates sometimes with people locally who, when surveyed, often will tell you that Boko Haram does not represent Islam. And yet that ideology, again, because it has this critique and it's intertwined with grievance, can be very powerful. And I think when you compare that organization to the state building project that's happened in Syria and Iraq under Islamic State, it's a very different type of dynamic. I mean, certainly in capability, certainly in aspirations. So I actually am very impressed with the way you asked the question, because these are very different conflicts, and to conflate them, I think, unfortunately, can have serious programmatic and policy implications.
As we think about kids getting recruited into these organizations, recruited is probably the wrong word, at least in some cases. How many of the kids, or what proportion, are being forced into the organization? How many are joining voluntarily? And is that even a distinction you can make?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, there's a problem. We don't even know how many kids are potentially involved. Despite our best efforts, despite the best efforts of many organizations, it's really hard to get a count. So, for instance, one of our researchers in Syria and Iraq would always ask children who had left Islamic State how many other children were in their units, just to try to get an idea for how many kids we were talking about. And sometimes those percentages went up to 75%. So we think there's a lot of kids, but it's really hard to get a hard grasp on numbers. So that can make it difficult to answer your question. But I will say that child recruitment into armed groups across conflicts occurs along a continuum of coercion. So even when children join, quote unquote, voluntarily, they are often subject to really significant stressors and all types of coercive pressures. So that could be anything from, we interviewed a 17-year-old named Amr, that's not his real name, who had gone to work in a quite dangerous factory at the age of 12, left school because Islamic State had killed his father, who was an Iraqi police officer. And then 5 years later, the Islamic State came to him and offered him money to cook for Islamic State fighters. And even though they had killed his father, he was now the main breadwinner for a family of 7. And so for him, there were no other options to support his family in the way that he had now been sort of elevated to do in the family. So I think we need to think about this sort of more expansively when we think about coercion. I mean, it could be everything from physical coercion to families pressuring children, to families encouraging children because of their alliances, or sometimes they think they're protecting children. It's better than what might be coming down the road in the conflict. So I think this sort of coercive spectrums lets us think about this. And as you say, this dichotomy between voluntary and involuntary doesn't really make sense in modern conflict.
To what extent do you see people preying on a teenager's natural sort of, there's been a lot written about this. I'm certainly no expert, but teenagers have a natural inclination to push back against authority, to some extent against their parents. There's a natural inclination to rebel. Are these, Boko Haram and ISIS, are they preying on that natural instinct of young people, especially young men, to rebel in that way?
Absolutely. And I think Islamic State, we had very clear evidence of this in our case study. And what we found is very specifically, you had Islamic State representatives saying to young people, your parents aren't, operating in the true way. It's your duty to sort of buck authority and to push back and not to obey them and to obey us, because we're actually we're carrying the mantle for Islam. We are the Islamic State. So we have very specific evidence that exactly was happening in Syria and Iraq. One more thing, if you'll allow me just to mention, because you're talking about this sort of stage of development for young people and their tendency to buck authority. But there's a lot more going on, I think, as well for adolescents that's really key to understanding this problem, whether it's the importance of peers. So in general, parents are not as important when we have teenagers, and they look to peers for information about what's normative, what's right, what they should be doing. That's a very powerful dynamic that I think is important to understand here. But I also think that these are young people that are coming of age, and they're trying to find out who they are, who they belong to, and what their role and significance is in the world. That is a really powerful driver across conflicts. And we tend to see these groups, particularly groups like Boko Haram or Islamic State, in very negative lenses from our sort of Western perspective. But the truth is, in many ways, the messages they're sending out go beyond these sort of propaganda, violent films, and are much more about building something, being part of something. And that can have enormous appeal to young people, particularly to young people who are in the midst of conflict and chaos, where nothing makes sense. You have no idea what's coming the next day. And this provides sort of a community, a ready-made community, a ready-made identity, and a ready-made sense of purpose.
I think the central question that really comes out of this, your efforts to do the report, I mean, the primary purpose of the report is to guide action. So as you think about how social entrepreneurs, nonprofits, NGOs around the world are trying to engage with youth, to protect them from, this recruitment or inducement or enslavement, whatever it is. What do people take from the report? How do they adapt their actions and strategies? How do they improve their efforts?
Absolutely. I think one of the most important things we can do is to engage children and youth themselves. So that means engage them about their experience. When you do this type of research, there are always ethical concerns about engaging vulnerable populations, particularly those who have gone through pretty traumatic events. But if we don't engage them, we're not hearing firsthand about their experience, what life was like, what drove them into this situation, what happened within the group, why they exited, what they need now. So we do need to find a way to balance our need both for information, but also our need to protect this population, but to talk to them, to get their voice and perspective. But it doesn't end there. It's not just as research subjects or not just as, in intake surveys for beneficiaries for programs, but really it's about seeing them as partners. A lot of the discussion around youth and youth bulges is always seeing youth as a threat. And here, I really think that youth are an enormous resource that we can draw upon, not only sort of broadly in society, but very specifically, even those youth and children who have been involved in conflict, they should be partners on their own road to recovery. And that means engaging them in the design of programs. That means engaging them in the assessment of programs. And we have information that suggests this works. There are domestic studies here in schools that suggest when adults and researchers have gone to children in high schools where they've had problems with violence and conflict and said, what does that mean to you? What does conflict mean in your school? And what would you do about it? And then they've helped them design child and youth-led programming. And within a year, there's been significant drops in violent conflict in those schools. So I think we have a lot of indications that this is the way we should be going, but it can be really difficult. As a researcher, does that mean that I have youth research partners? Do you invite, as a policymaker, youth to come to 3-hour board meetings? How do we do this in a way that actually makes sense? That is challenging. It requires more time. It requires more money and thought, but I think it's worth it.
One of the things that concerns me about this whole topic, this whole area, the tragedy of children working as soldiers in one form or another in so many places, is that once they are in, horrific things happen to them, and they do horrific things, which then they must live with for the rest of their lives. How do you think about, how do you propose we proceed in helping the 16-year-olds, the 17-year-olds that we can pull out of that experience, and the 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds that we're pulling out who were recruited as children but have been in so long they're now adults? How do you think about helping those groups of people?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question and something that will be a huge issue for us moving forward as we have so many conflicts ongoing with so many young people potentially involved. I will just mention that involvement can mean all kinds of things. So we have people who do support work for all of these types of armed groups, whether it's cooking, whether it's cleaning, whether it's guarding and ammunition stock or something like that. And then there's not this hard separation. So there are a lot of people who, in doing those and other tasks, may also be involved in violence as well. They may also be victims of violence. They may be witnesses to violence. I mean, the fact is that children are being exposed to enormous amounts of violence, both within the group and also children who never, are in the group, but are just local in conflict zones. So how do we help them? I think this is not my field, but from the psychosocial research that we have, you get sort of a debate. There is significant research that talks about the trauma and how significant it is and how much people would need support to work through it. You also have some research that says, children are amazingly resilient. And so to focus on this really trauma story is not the whole story. And we need to think about sort of positive perspectives of resilience and how we can bolster those as well, which I think is an important part of the discussion. I also think you brought up a really important piece, which is those people who went in as children but came out as adults. So those individuals, those youth are not afforded the same legal protections when they come out as under 18s. They also don't necessarily get the same level of programming. They also have expectations on their shoulders that are similar for adults, even though they lost their formative education years and their formative development years to being an armed group. And there is some emerging research that suggests this is a very, very vulnerable population that often gets overlooked. So I think that's a really key part of this. And there's a lot of work out there about what particular types of interventions might be helpful, but definitely sort of priming families and communities for taking these people back into the fold and supporting them long after international actors and the very sort of distinct programs, whether it's 16 weeks or 6 months that they sometimes offer, will end and wrap up. But how do we create communities that have the resilience to sort of take these war-affected children, youth, and quite frankly, adults back in and move past this cycle of conflict?
People like you and me who live in the West and in affluent communities tend to think of this as a problem that exists for people in Nigeria and Syria and Iraq, as you point out. But kids in the developed world, in the United States and across Europe, are not exempt from this entirely, are they? Some are recruited and with painful, horrific results in some cases. I think of the the Boston bombers, right? In some respects, their experience is similar to these kids that we're talking about. How do you coach and advise those of us who live in the developed world where we're not at war in our communities, where we're not surrounded by the same sort of violence? How do we inoculate our kids against this? How do we interact with them in a way that protects them?
It's a really hard question. I mean, partly because we don't fully understand, and partly because this is such an individualized journey. I mean, you could have two siblings exposed to the same exact conditions and have one child head towards an armed group and engagement in violence, and you can have another with absolutely no issues on that front. And so it's really hard to do predictive prevention. In conflict zones, it's a little bit easier in the sense that there are certain factors that have, huge widespread effects. So when you have a population that is hungry and there's so much food insecurity, and the only person or employer that can offer a meal or a wage is an armed group, it's pretty obvious that that will affect a lot of people. But when we're talking about Western kids or kids living in the West, it's a lot more difficult. And I do think that there are some interesting similarities if we think about the question a bit more broadly, which is, to take a risk accumulation model and to think about in, psychology or with criminology, young people, when they are exposed to a lot of stressors, risks, or they exhibit a lot of needs, they potentially are in a situation where they are susceptible to all types of adverse outcomes, whether it's drug abuse, whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's involvement in a street gang. And so I don't think it's that unusual or that different to think about potential draws or susceptibility to recruitment into one of these other groups. One thing our research did find is that even though, social media is important in the lives of young Syrians, it wasn't necessarily a main sort of facilitator per se for local children or local youth to become involved in Islamic State or other groups. But when we look at children who have traveled from further afield, that is their one way, other than sort of broader media, for engaging with a conflict that they're interested in. And so engaging in the conflict, engaging with its victims, its perpetrators, the armed groups specifically. So that can have more of a influential factor. But I do think it's also important because we talk about social media in a really negative way, and you have people ask questions like, should we shut down all these conversations? I'm not necessarily sure that's going to help, particularly because we have anecdotal evidence from young people in the West who talk about when they weren't given the opportunity to engage in debates around the Syrian conflict that they were very passionate about. That was one of the things that led them to believe that they should actually just go to Syria. So I don't think cutting off debate, and I don't think viewing social media as entirely negative. We had a couple interesting stories, anecdotal, but still interesting in Syria, where people who had left Islamic State were being contacted through social media from former friends and other members asking, how did you get out? Can you please help me? I'm trying to get out. What was the best route to escape? And so it became this sort of virtual underground railroad for helping people leave. And there's also the potential for protective or preventive factors that could be sort of embedded there, and also sort of reintegration and facilitation of exit as well. So just a way to say that, I think we should think about some of these things a bit more broadly.
Yeah, you make a host of great points. I'm especially drawn to your observation that making this off limits, taboo for kids would just make it more appealing to them. They would just work that much harder to discover it, including going to Syria to figure it out. So great observations. Thank you. Siobhan, you are extraordinarily well educated. You have more degrees than I can count. You've done amazing things in your career. What is the most important lesson you've learned in your career?
Wow, that's a tough question. I don't know about my whole career, but I did learn a really important lesson in this project that I would love to share, because I think it's really relevant maybe to some of the work and some of the values that you've promoted in your work of late. And that's really about, as a researcher, you can put together an amazing research project with amazing findings, but it doesn't mean much if you can't tell a story and if you can't communicate more broadly with different audiences. And so I think for us, this book that we've just put out is a 260-page book, and it's very much aimed at policymakers and program managers who do not have time to read a 260-page book. And so along the way, it's really been an education for me to think about how can we engage them in other ways to make sure that those findings get uptake. And so things that I had not intended to do when I embarked on this project, I certainly had not originally budgeted, but we worked with a great filmmaker to help make a 10-minute, 2-minute, and then 30-second little video clips featuring some of our researchers to ensure sort of greater uptake and access for these research findings. We worked with an amazing photographer, Diego Ibarra Sanchez, who has done an amazing series called Hijacked Education. And when I read about it in the New York Times and saw his images, they were very much a representation of some of the themes in our work. So he was very wonderful and donated some of his work to our book, but we also did a photo exhibit with his work to try to highlight in images what's happening to these children in the environment that they're living in that helps facilitate their entry into armed groups. And I think that's extremely powerful. Another thing is, trying to walk the walk. So we've talked a lot about engaging children, but how did we actually do it? And it's really difficult. And so we worked with We worked with a former child soldier from Sierra Leone, and he turned around and interviewed other former child soldiers from Sierra Leone 15 years after they demobilized to try to understand what the sort of current problems that they were facing and what had continued to prevent their successful reintegration into civilian life. And then one of the other ways that we did this was work with an NGO that works with war-affected children and teaches them photography so that they can learn to share their own story without any sort of intermediary from an adult, unvarnished. And these images are so hopeful and wonderful. So all of these experiences in communicating and engaging the right partners, but also communicating the findings were extremely eye-opening to me, and I think how I will do my work moving forward.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Siobhan, I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. We've gone way over what I promised we would do, and I'm so sorry. But thank you for taking the extra time to deal with these really important, challenging questions. It's been a great discussion. Before you go, though, if you would, just tell people how they can get a copy of your report.
Absolutely. So I will share with you, and maybe you can share the URL on the bottom of the screen, but on our website, unu.edu, we have a collection of pieces that we've put out as part of this project. This project was called the Children in Extreme Violence Project. So if you Google that, you'll come across our latest report, which is Cradled by Conflict, Child Involvement with Armed Groups in Contemporary Conflict, plus a number of other publications, some of them very short, that might be of interest if for someone who's interested in the topic.
Fantastic. Well, Siobhan, thank you so much for being with us today. We wish you every success in the great work you're doing there at United Nations University.
Thank you so much for having me on.
All righty, let's do some good.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was recorded via Google Hangouts on Air and is available at youtube.com/Devin Thorpe. Subscribe to this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes by searching for Your Mark on the World. Every weekday, Devin hosts a CEO, celebrity, entrepreneur, or other changemaker here on the Your Mark on the World show to inspire and prepare you to make your mark. Devin is a champion of social good, writing about, advocating for, and advising people who are doing good. He is a Forbes contributor who is a recognized thought leader in social entrepreneurship, impact investing, and crowdfunding. To book Devin as a speaker, visit devinthorpe.com. Learn more about Devin's work at yourmarkontheworld.com.